Hey everyone, welcome back to Verified Podcast Season 2. And as Pastor Cody would say, we are super excited for you to join us as we talk this month about managing our lives. If you haven't yet, go ahead and hit that subscribe button on YouTube or Spotify and iTunes, and you will be notified every time we come out with a new episode. But to pump us up, why don't we get the music going and let's start today's podcast.
Verified.
Well, hey guys, welcome back to Verified Christian Podcast. We are super excited to have you joining us today on the show. And I don't know if we call it a show now because it's really a podcast, but with this music, it feels like a show, doesn't it? Gets me amped up. I'm joined, as always, by Mark Anderson, Pastor Mark here. Sorry, the music threw me off there at the end. I'm joined here by Pastor Mark today and also by Kyla Peterson.
Hey, Kyla. Yay. Oh, hey, they clap for you. Yeah.
Kyla is our first guest speaker on this new series we're doing on managing the issues of life. And today we're talking about managing crisis. I'm going to get into that more in just a little bit. But I know we've taken a break for the fall, and this is our first one back. So we're kind of doing podcasts in these little mini series where we have 4 podcasts or so, all talking about different aspects of the same subject. And in that, we're going to be mixing it up, bringing to you different gifted guest speakers from our body and people that we know to come on the podcast as well. And you'll always see either me, Mark, or Heather here interviewing
Are you
them.
gifted? Are you gifted?
Apparently.
This is awesome.
She's our gifted
Yeah.
guest today for our podcast. And we're so excited you're here, Kyla.
Yes,
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Okay, don't talk unless we talk to you, okay? I'm just I'm going to talk about Kyla for just a second, though. The reason we picked Kyla for this first one on managing these life issues, especially for managing crisis, is you're actually an ER nurse, right?
That's correct. I'm an ER nurse.
How has that been? What is that like?
Well, it definitely is never constant, I guess. Like there's always something new or weird or crazy that's happening, right? And there is some stability in being an ER nurse, but then you never cease to be amazed by something new.
Well, as soon as you say that, I know all of our podcast listeners, including myself, are like, you got to share one story.
I want to hear stories. Yeah.
What's the weirdest, craziest, most appropriate thing you could say on this podcast that's happened?
Weirdest, craziest, most appropriate. Well, so, and I certainly hope that I don't freak anybody out. I'll do my best not to. There was a gentleman who came in. He had been in a terrible car accident, and somehow his insides sort of all detached but stayed inside, so his top half laid upright on the bed and his bottom half laid the opposite direction.
Oh, how is that even possible?
That was probably the craziest thing I've ever seen.
And did he live?
Unfortunately, no, he didn't.
Ugh. Thanks for starting this
Yeah.
day off with a dark story.
On that note.
Yeah.
Because I had another
Crisis.
friend. I had another friend who was an ER nurse, and she told me that one of the weirdest things she ever saw is there was a guy who came in who had like stirred up a giant beehive. And Kyla knows where this is going. You've probably seen weird things like this, huh? He had been stung everywhere, like every square inch. And check this out. His lungs were full of bees.
Actual bees?
Yeah, he was like unconscious, and like his nose, his lungs, she's like anywhere there's a hole, there was bees. And she's like, and he lived, and it was painful. But they had to pump all the bees out of his lungs. Isn't that
That's
horrible?
Oh, my gosh.
Suck them out of his nose and ears.
Oh, my gosh. I'm glad it's you and not me.
Yeah, so managing crisis. That's why we have Kyla here today, because crisis finds all of us. And this is the reality about crisis. This is the definition of it, actually. It is described as a time of intense difficulty, trouble, or danger. And that is true physically, and it is true spiritually.
Yep.
That's why we got Pastor Mark here joining us, because, Mark, you've seen a lot of people in your time who have gone through spiritual faith crisis. And we're going to talk about crises. Yep. There's the word. And we're going to talk about both. And this idea of managing is maintaining control or influence over something. And so the reality about crisis is you can't always control how it comes about. You can't control what it's about, but you can control oftentimes what your response is going to be towards that crisis. And that could actually have a say on its impact in your life, at least, and how it's going to go. So that's kind of what we're talking about today.
Okay.
I just had a random thought that just popped in my head. If it's a crisis and it comes on suddenly, I'm assuming crisis. If you saw it coming, it wouldn't be quite the crisis. Can you prepare for something like that?
If you saw a crisis coming,
Well, I mean, in general, we're going to hear talk about managing crisis. So by talking about it, are we going to be better prepared to handle it when it comes, if we think about it?
I think so, because it's kind of like that podcast we had Mark Timmons on for. He was talking about your training. I think it was the courage one from last year, where he said your training
Kicks in.
He's like, are you
remember that
courageous
phrase.
or are you just trained? And I thought that was kind of an interesting idea. And I think it's the same in crisis, right? If you've prepared yourself, I guess in some ways, like this is what my response should be, or here's what I can manage. It's obviously going to look different, but I think there is a bit of that is, if you're trained to respond to something, you're going to do better in it. Kyla, what are your thoughts, though?
Yeah.
I think there's a couple different ways that you can sort of quasi prepare, so to speak, for
That's
crisis.
a great word, by the way, quasi.
Sort of. In my medical world, in the ER, we prepare in a couple different ways. And one of the things that we do is through mitigation. So that's sort of like the fancy word for sort of trying to prevent the depth a disaster might actually have, right? So you might assess what you might be more at risk for, like, for example, earthquakes, or, we know in the ER certain diagnoses will come in pretty frequently, and we prepare for those, right? We kind of make sure we have all of the things ready for that. On the bigger scale, like earthquakes, we try to prevent the damage an earthquake might have. So you might do seismic retrofittings of buildings or something. So then when it strikes, maybe it's not quite as devastating. And then for those things that you can't mitigate, I think, like you mentioned, Mark Timmons mentioned, preparing and practicing and training and all of that stuff, so that when it does happen, your instincts sort of kick in.
Yeah.
I like that word, mitigate. You
So do I.
can't prevent it, but you're trying to manage the damage
Yes.
in some way to keep it from being as bad as it could be.
Absolutely.
I like that. I'll bet you we could find an analogy with that spiritually.
Well, I think biblically you're just talking about stewardship,
Okay.
because you think about it, a lot of times when we get to crisis, especially on a personal level or a spiritual level, it's because we ignored it up to a certain point. Now, I'm not talking about like a medical crisis, something like that. I'm talking about personal issue, life issue crises. A lot of times those come up because we didn't want to deal with the problem. We didn't want to mitigate when we had a chance. And the problem got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until it became a full-on crisis.
Yeah.
And then you're in trouble.
I remember a guy that I trained under when I first became in ministry. He said, it's easier to get the elephant out when he's young. If you let that elephant grow up in the barn, you gotta tear the barn down to get the elephant out. And I always thought that's a crazy analogy, but what he was trying to help me understand is in ministry, there are times when problems are manageable. If you ignore them, they rarely go away, and they usually come back bigger. So I think that's kind of interesting. I never thought this podcast would go this direction, but it's nice.
And yet
Good job.
here we are.
Here we are.
But crisis, you never know which direction it will go.
Crisis. Yeah.
Kyla, by the way, that was a joke earlier when I said don't talk unless we talk to you. That's really just a joke.
I'm really offended.
All the other
Just kidding.
listeners
Well, the reason I'm
are
letting you know is
writing to
because
us right now.
Mark and I will just start preaching. You're sitting with two pastors here, so you just got to throw some elbows.
Just
Poor
jump on in. Okay.
Heather's had to learn the hard way. You just got to cut people off and jump in.
We have been accused of hogging the time.
You can
Okay.
lean over, push Mark's mic away from his mouth, and just be like, no, my turn.
Stiff arm.
Yeah.
Okay.
So talk to us about crisis then, because it really is something that we all experience. I mean, it's kind of part of the human experience, crisis is. And we can kind of pull that apart a little bit later, but for the most part, what do you do, Kyla, when you're facing the unexpected, ginormous issues that just all of a sudden roll onto your plate?
Ooh, that's a great question. It's very multifaceted.
Like,
because
do you eat lots of chocolate? or-
Probably. I don't deny it. Yeah, we have a lot of different stress responses, right? When we're faced with something really challenging, you might go get some comfort food, or you might go exercise. I probably do both of those things. Sometimes a therapeutic cry is really good. I would like to think that I turn to the Lord in prayer, and I might cry out, for wisdom or guidance or answers or grace or mercy or healing or whatever the situation might be.
Yeah.
But I definitely think in the midst of or as you start to face a crisis, sort of initially getting some perspective from the very beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah, just
that's a
kind
great
of
word.
understanding, okay, is this really a crisis or maybe I'm overreacting, you know? I think we
Yeah.
have a tendency to do that too sometimes.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think that's such a great piece of advice, Kyla, because when crisis comes, there's always that initial moment of panic and anxiety, and pausing to get perspective can really go a long ways in mitigating your own personal response to how you're going to handle it.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, something might happen that might feel very upsetting to me at the time. I mean, I'm thinking of a few weeks ago, and it was probably a combination of several stressful things throughout the day, you know. So by the end of the day, that last little thing, you know, suddenly, you know, dinner reservations are canceled. And I'm like, what are we going to do?
The crisis.
It's a crisis. Like, all right.
I got to schedule that therapeutic cry right about
Right,
now.
exactly.
Right about
It's like,
now.
all right, is this really a crisis? And, you know, is my life actually falling apart or am I just having a moment? You know, maybe I need to take a step back, right?
Take a breath.
That is such a good
that
analogy.
is a great analogy.
And sometimes, I mean, that's probably like a pretty severe analogy, but I think there are some times when sometimes life is hard, right? And I certainly don't mean to, you know, to negate any of that, right? To say life is sometimes really challenging, and yet it still may not be a crisis, so to speak, you know,
Yeah.
I think the implication of crisis also kind of says like, it's kind of a little bit of a turning point, right? Like you have decisions to make, you have to go one way or the other, right? So sometimes life is very hard and stressful and you continue on and you do your best and you know, by the grace of God, you move forward. But then sometimes
Yeah.
you have that point in which you have to say, ooh, something has to happen.
Well, and I think, like you were saying, in our culture, people tend to overinflate their issue and their crisis. And maybe it wasn't. This is what's so interesting. So I was going to think about, we could talk about it later, but we can talk about it now. Sometimes you're not in crisis, but you can create crisis. And I think people do that for themselves sometimes, where your overreaction is just setting you up for an even worse fallout.
Oh, they have no doubt about
And
that.
I'm by no means talking about the person who just got news that they lost a loved one or there's a medical emergency or something like that. We're really talking about like the personal issues that come throughout our day, in our workplace, in our home, dinner plans getting canceled. Like, if you're not careful, you can actually make something that wasn't crisis bigger than it was, and then it could become a real crisis.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's interesting that when you were talking about that, I think about some people I know that need crisis in order to get the adrenaline flowing, in order to get them moving. It seems
Yeah.
like they just live from one crisis to another. When I compare my life to theirs, I go, man, I'd go crazy if I had this situation. But it seems like, at least the couple I'm thinking of right now, they just have one crisis after the next crisis after the next crisis. And so you have to wonder what part they're playing in setting the whole thing up.
I can think about some football teams that do that too.
Hey, be quiet. I can think of that too. Yeah, actually, yeah.
They don't play until it's third quarter and they're down by 35 points.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. But that's interesting. I like the way you're talking about just trying to get some perspective in the initial reaction to it. So, you know, and even asking the question, is this really a crisis? I think that's wisdom.
And I think
Yeah.
what you said, Mark, about, you know, just people maybe making crisis or overreacting. And, you know, I think we have to be mindful of idolizing crisis a little
Yeah,
bit, you know, because anything, if we hang on to it for too long, you know, or if it takes the place of God, you know, it can be an idol. And sometimes people kind of rely on that to sort of in their identity, you know, to have these
Yeah.
crises all the time.
Yeah, I think my mother
such a good
needed a
word,
crisis all
Kyla.
the time. We used to try to get the medical dictionary away from her because she would read about these diseases and then mysteriously develop them. You know?
Right.
So it's kind of crazy. She needed a crisis in order to just validate her reason for being alive. You know, kind of sad. Threw you a curve there, didn't I, buddy boy?
No, that's a good one. That's a good one. Because crisis comes, and I love what you said. Hit the pause. Just push the pause button. In fact, I had a theologian friend who just used to write the word pause and circle it like a button on a sticky note and just stick it in front of his desk. So he could just remember to push the pause button and stop and literally just pause. And I think it's such a good habit for crisis. Like, crisis has hit, I'm going to pause. I'm going to gain some perspective. I'm going to respond. And I think in that there's some gray area which one needs to come first. But I think getting perspective and responding wisely usually go hand in hand together. And I was just thinking about how, like, Job, when he received, terrible news that it's like, your sheep are gone, and then the next guy's like, your camels are gone, and the guy after that's like, your servants are all gone, and then all leading up to the last one being like, all your children
kids are gone.
dead. And I can't imagine any one of those crises would be horrible, but to have all of them at once, and then to see him receive all that, and then choose to respond the way he did, and turn to the Lord, and even praise God.
That's a great analogy, and I hadn't thought of him when we were thinking about, different people in the Bible that face crisis. But look at the way his wife responded, totally different than him.
Oh, yeah. She's like, curse
She
God.
had the same loss.
Yeah.
Same loss as him, same property, same kids, same servants. But he said, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. She said, curse God and die.
Yeah.
Her approach was, let's just end it. It's not worth living. And what are you doing trying to still hang on to hope? So I think that's a great example of two people who handled crisis totally different.
Well, it was the same crisis, but it kind of set them both off on like a dramatically kind of different path emotionally between them both, because Job was going to cling to God and trust God to vindicate him in the end.
Yep.
And then you have his wife who's just spun off into bitterness and animosity now towards God.
Right. Which is easy to understand. I'm not saying that I couldn't see me going there, but what a contrast between those two. So great analogy. Getting ready for it. Even if you would look at it then from where we started on this podcast, preparing for crisis is something Job couldn't do, but he did develop a relationship with God before it hit.
Yeah, boom.
That then enabled him when
That's a
it
great point.
did hit to have some resources to draw upon, which obviously his wife did not.
Yeah. Well, the last podcast we're going to talk about in this series is managing faith. So we're doing managing crisis, managing stress next week with Kyla's husband.
Now that's interesting.
John
Is he
Peterson.
the stressor or just the one that you create all this stress for your husband? And
Well, this is what's so funny.
we're going to ask him next week. And then,
Well, this is what's so funny is JP is a fire captain in Medford. So you have a fire captain who's married to an ER nurse. And so if anyone ever experiences crisis and stress, I imagine it's you two all the time.
not to mention the canceled dinner reservations.
No wonder. It was the end of the world, But we're also talking about managing money, and then the last one's going to be managing faith. And this is what's so important about crisis and faith, and how they're all three of those interconnected, is that faith is a muscle. It's a spiritual muscle that grows. Yep. And if you've ever worked out, working out is very hard and it's intense, and it breaks muscles down and it tears them so that they can build themselves back up and be bigger and stronger. And I love what you said there, Mark, about Job prepared his relationship with the Lord ahead of time.
Yeah.
It's not that Job was like, oh, I think I'm going to lose everything, so I'm going to choose to know God. Job had chosen to know God. And when everything else failed, that faith got a chance to flex,
True.
and cling on to God.
That's a great way to announce it.
Yeah. And so I think right now, something people can be doing, preparing for crisis, at least on a spiritual level, is really asking yourself the question, do I trust God?
Yeah.
Do I actually trust God? I just had a conversation with somebody recently. Do you trust God? Because that right there, if you're honest with yourself, that's going to change a lot of things for you.
I would agree, and I'd just jump in and say, sometime when I'm doing my devotions in the morning, I'll really sense the Holy Spirit just asking me, do you trust me?
Yeah.
Because the things that are going on in life can spin you, and you can see them through maybe a lens that is distorted, like overreacting we talked about. Well,
Yeah.
I think that, when you say, do I trust God? Man, oh man, if you can't honestly answer that, then you need to do some flexing and get that muscle strengthened, but you're right.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
some spiritual curls.
Absolutely. Get your
Call that meditation.
Get your Bible
It
out
is,
and get
yeah.
to do some spiritual curls or whatever.
Yeah.
I think having faith and trusting the Lord is like a very key part, because part of the crisis response can be sort of that fear of the unknown, right? When crisis
Yeah.
hits, 1,000 questions probably come into your mind about, where's this going? What's going to happen? Like
Yes.
a personal experience about a year ago when John, my husband, fell and fractured his patella, and he needed surgery, and he's doing great now, thank goodness. But right after it happened, there was so many questions and fear of the unknown. Like, is he going to be able
Can he
to work and be a firefighter and climb ladders and, and all of that stuff? And how long is he going to be out for? And, you can really let your mind go crazy with questions and unknown. And again, taking a moment of perspective and saying, you know what, I can't possibly know these answers right now, but I trust that God is sovereign and in control, and that he has my best interests at heart, and that he's going to work this situation out.
That's beautiful.
That's so beautiful.
It really is.
I'm not saying it's easy in that moment, and I don't think we always automatically go there, but that's where I would aspire to, maybe.
And that's where your fears, though, if you feed your fears, the what if, man, oh man, it's going to create that crisis and amp that way up to where you're not going to be able to think properly and even breathe properly. So feeding your faith is critical.
Yes.
And really taking time to step back and say, are these fears even valid? And why am I giving them so much credence? And I can't control it anyway.
Yeah.
So, why don't I give this over to God? The old timers said, I don't know who about tomorrow, but I know who holds tomorrow.
Yeah.
It's great.
And I think that's such a good story, Kyla sharing. And you started sharing that all of a sudden, like, it takes me back to the hallway at the NICU when my little son was born. And, we're there and they're scanning him and they're not sure if he's going to be need to be flighted to Portland. They're not sure what they're going to do. And it's like later than 3 a.m, close to maybe 4. And, they're like, you just need to go home because you can't stay here. This isn't like a hospital spot where you can stay. And it was just
How hard.
And there's nothing you can do. And that's like the worst. And that crisis does come. And I think we say there's nothing I can do, but the reality is there still is something you can do. And I know for me and my wife, that was our only comfort, really, was the Lord and each other. Yeah. And I praise God we made that choice, because there were other poor choices we could have made and did make. But choosing to say, all right, like you said, we're just going to have to rely on the Lord and come around each other and support each other. I think that's the way God... Why it's weird to say God designed us to go through crisis, because we're really not. I mean, that's the fallout of sin, is where crisis has come. That's the original crisis, was man choosing to rebel from God. And all crisis has spawned out of that. But God has given us fellowship and relationship with himself, and he's given us fellowship with the body, and in the body we find mutual encouragement and comfort with one another. But then I also think about how David wrote and would say, Lord, you're like my strong tower. You're my citadel of, that I'm going to run into and find refuge. Yeah. And that's who the Lord wants to be for us.
Yeah. Well, David learned that early in his life, and I think that's the benefit of crisis, is that as you face them, you begin to develop a backlog of, God took me through it, God met me in it, God's rescued me from it. I can trust him. It's not going to destroy me because God's got my back. And I even think about the story you told about you and your wife, that it's kind of cool that now you guys have that part of your story where you turn to each other, you turn to the Lord. So when the next crisis comes, hopefully that will continue to be like your reflex. Where do I go? I'm going to go to my wife. I'm going to go to my support structure. I'm going to go to my God. And I think that would be a good way to look at it.
Well, God definitely did use it in a positive way in our lives. And Laura and I feel much closer today than we did before that. But I know that crisis can have the opposite effect on people too.
Oh, man.
And because here's the thing, when you believe in crisis that you can't manage anything, you're actually lying to yourself. Because it's like my baseball coach used to always say, you may not be able to control anything else, but you can't control yourself. You can control the way you're going to choose to respond. And I think that is such a stellar piece of advice. Even in crisis, you can choose the way you're going to react, like Job did. And that's going to have a benefit or a negative impact on your situation.
Yeah, I like to say, and I don't want to dominate, but I like to say that when I'm talking to people about that you have a choice to either become bitter or better.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This is, it's not so much the problem, because you can't control that, but you can control where that problem comes. Does it come between me and my God and drive me away? Or does it come on the other side and drive me too?
Or does it drive me away from fellowship? A lot of people choose isolation.
Oh, they do. I mean, they just, they go, I can't handle it, I'm stepping away. And in that isolation, it's not like the problem gets any smaller.
No.
You just get the less ability. You don't have somebody there to support you and share it.
Yeah. Kyla, you see people dealing with crisis all day long, which is kind of weird to think that what you call work, other people call crisis. You're like, I'm going to work today, and other people are about to have the worst day of their life, and they don't know it yet. And you probably see people choose to respond to that differently. Give us a little bit of insight.
Sure. I mean, physiologically, we are designed to respond to crisis in a particular way. You guys have probably heard of like fight or flight, right? Like our body,
or freeze.
Does certain things, responds and, sends chemicals to tell us to like be prepared to do something, right? And so we see some of those reactions in the emergency department for sure. People who get really amped up, people who unfortunately get so mad and frustrated that they start to get violent for sure. You have other people that, run away, they're distraught, they, go off to their car, they leave, they can't handle being there right, at that moment. I was also hearing about a lesser sort of side of that response that we have in the same context of tend and befriend, along with the fight or flight, where a lot of people seek out other people, their support system, like you were saying, you and Laura, right? And so we do see, when a crisis happens, you call your friends and your relatives and your loved ones to, of course, tell them what's going on, but also because they're your support system. And it does tend to, make that relationship stronger in those ways.
Absolutely.
So we kind of see a myriad of different ways that people respond.
Yeah. So it really seems like if we were starting to like put down bullet points for people, crisis has struck. So step A is get perspective. And that can come from the Lord. It can come from stepping back from your situation. It can come from talking to a friend. But then either way, the next response is going to be like, who's your support network, right? So crisis has come. I'm going to get perspective. I'm going to lean on the Lord. I'm going to open myself up and be vulnerable to others and say, man, I'm in crisis. I need help. Even if it's just accountability. And here's what I love about this is because we've been talking a lot about the crisis that strikes, but what about the crisis you create? I can't tell you the people who have started to I'll just try marijuana or a drug or something like that. Or I'm just going to go ahead and view pornography or try alcohol or some habit that's not good. And then they get sucked in. And where there wasn't a crisis, now there is a crisis.
Yeah.
And their whole life is on the verge of collapse and relationships with loved ones and things like that. And so I think choosing to be vulnerable towards people in crisis is also a responsible choice to say, I can't do this alone. Right. And sometimes especially if it's like a secret crisis, you're not really going to make it through, chances are, unless you open up and talk about it.
Yeah. Well, and if we're talking to somebody that kind of hits a note with, I would say that if your irresponsibility continues and you don't take responsibility for what you're doing, it's going to create a crisis for you and others that you love. Yeah. Because your irresponsibility is going to someday become somebody else's responsibility. Yeah. If you fail to do what you can do to get out and to take control of those bad choices that are leading you somewhere you don't want to end up, then somebody else is going to be affected by that. That's the sad reality of it.
Yeah, especially when it comes to like a sin issue crisis, it's not going to be just your crisis in the end.
Right.
That's what they say. They say backsliding never just affects you. You're going to create a crisis for the people you love.
Right. Well, to me, it's like taking that black tape and putting it over the idiot light on your car when your car engine light comes on, check engine, and you say, I don't want to deal with that. And you just put some black tape over it so you don't have to see it. Well, that may take the pain away right now, but it's certainly not going to take it away later when that problem has now grown into a bigger one. And I think that applies to life too, where instead of taking the little signals that are saying, maybe you got a little issue here that's going to lead you into a crisis, now's the time to take an honest look at that and to really find out. Not let it drive your bus, but don't ignore it either.
Yeah.
It's very humbling if you get to that point for sure when you recognize that you in fact did cause your own crisis.
I've been there. Yeah, I've done it.
Sure. So have I.
Me too.
When you have to admit, that's my fault, and I need to fix it. And it's hard to also reach out for help, especially when you were the cause of the problem.
Yeah, like when you cancel your own dinner
Reservation. You show up.
Dang it, that one's on me.
That one's I wish it was that easy, on a light one. But
Kyla, you're so right on, and you too, Mark.
Yeah.
And this is such a broad, kind of vast topic because we tend as humans to create our own problems quite often. And what we don't think about is how those problems are affecting others. It's easy to think about, like, if I had a medical crisis, how would that affect my wife and my son? And I plan for that. Like, I went out and got life insurance and things like that, and I have medical insurance, and I see my doctor, and I get blood work done, and I exercise because I'm trying to mitigate a crisis that I know, I'll probably face at some point in my life. And so what can I do now to make sure that I'm healthy and strong, or whatever, Lord willing, if that should happen. And yet, when we think about our sin and these spiritual things, we don't take the same approach a lot of times because it is personal. And it's not like to be honest, it's not like we all have really good habits of getting up and reading the Bible and that would be the same thing, right? As getting life insurance and eating well and exercise, all the ways I'm trying to mitigate physical crisis or medical physical crisis. What about spiritual crisis? What am I doing to mitigate that?
Well, that's critically important. And when you read through the Psalms, you see that the guys who really had their faith together before, when crisis hits, they run to the strong tower. They run to the Lord for safety. They run to the family of God for help. And those that don't and didn't have that, then they fall apart. And I think we can see that with all the various stories in the Bible of people who did it wrong. You and I were talking about one story in the Old Testament where David loses all of his stuff. His wives are taken, all of his property's taken, and
all 600 of his men.
Yeah. And so instead of they decide they're going to stone him. Somehow it must be his fault because he's the leader, and he instead seeks the Lord. And what a contrast! They freak out because something's happened that overwhelmed them, and they turn to the natural thing they know to take, and that is to blame somebody. And then David, instead of blaming somebody, said, I need to seek someone, and wrapped himself around the Lord. So I think it's critically important. And I just wanted to take one little kind of divergent turn here. I think as a nation and as a people, we are kind of going through a crisis right now.
Yeah.
I think this is a great timely subject, managing to the best of degree things we can't manage, things that are done out of our control that affect us.
Yeah.
And how are we going to navigate that, and how are we going to mitigate that? I love that term, mitigate. I think that's really critically important.
Managing mitigation, we should call this podcast.
Minimizing damage. What control do I have, and what can I affect, and what are the choices I can make within my situation that will and somehow lessen the damage to me and to those that I love.
Well, I'm glad you brought this up because I wanted to take that next step of transition to you, because as a nation, we're in a crisis.
Yeah.
We're in a pandemic. We have financial instability. We have political instability. We have work instability. All the problems that...
Shortages in the grocery store. People are freaking out about that. Yeah.
Yeah. We went through a time when toilet paper was like bars of gold.
That is a crisis now. Let's be honest. That's a crisis.
It's true. It's true.
It'll wipe
Unless you
you
have
out.
a bidet. So.
Yeah. That's right. Better put one in your house.
Better put one in. They're not that expensive on Amazon. You can get bidet attachments for like $13.
Let's not go there, okay?
Real story, though, in case you're like, how am I going to get toilet paper? There you go.
There you go.
But let's talk about that, because our nation is in a crisis, and as a corporate group, we are facing crisis, but it hasn't individually, in a sense, maybe impacted us all the same. But people live with the fear and the dread of this crisis. And for a lot of people, that weight alone is bearing them.
Yeah.
And you're like, you're actually okay. Like, you don't have the virus, you haven't lost your house, you haven't lost your job, but the fear of it all is crushing them.
I think so. And you can just feel it in some circles where it's the out of control, don't know what's going to happen, I need somebody to blame.
Yeah.
Or somebody to rescue. And I think that's that feeling of being out of control. I don't know what to do next. And hopefully we can help people, encourage them, and take steps ourselves to kind of make sure that we're seeking the Lord. We're turning towards God. We're pulling towards the family of God. We're asking ourselves the question, is this really a crisis? What can I do within it to kind of maintain some kind of sanity?
Talk to us about it, Kyla, because you see, I mean, I know the hospitals have just been crazy with everything that's going on, whether that's because you're understaffed or you need more people or, you're trying to take care of everyone's problems on top of now specialized problems that a pandemic has created. What are your thoughts for people who are just living under the dread of what our nation's going through right now?
That's a really tough one. I definitely haven't been immune to it personally either, where at certain moments, a lot of stuff hits you all at once and you just, feel very overwhelmed at times for sure. So yeah, great question. Big question. I think there's a charge nurse I work with in the ER. One day was just, really tragic. No beds, patients coming in ambulances, constantly, COVID still happening, all the things, just everything all at once. And I went out there and I was like, what do you need? And, her initial reaction was like, well, I need more beds. I need more beds to put people in. Well, I clearly can't give that to her at this moment. So a little bit of managing expectations or managing what is realistic, right? And I said, if you can think of anything that could tangibly help at this moment, is there something? And she thought about it and said, the phone is ringing off the hook. Can you get me someone to just answer the phone? So that's what we worked on, right? You can't sometimes, handle every big issue, but sometimes you can just take little pieces of it. Yeah. Because, a lot of times it's like, what are we doing about this? Like we're freaking out. And anyway, and it's like, well, it's kind of, a marathon, so to speak, of, you have to, take things slowly, step by step, and change doesn't always happen very quickly, but you do things little by little to the best of your ability.
Yeah.
I like that.
That's a good word,
Yeah,
Kyla.
it really is. Because you can't handle everything all at once, and we do freak out. But freaking out, continuing to freak out, is going to make things worse on everybody.
Yes.
And at some point, somebody has to step in and say, okay, this obviously freaking out is not helping anyone. What can we do to kind of? There's a lot of things we can't control. Let's think. I like that. What can we control tangibly that would kind of move us towards get some sense of, okay, I'm going to mitigate this to the best of my ability. I like that a lot. I can think of all kinds of spiritual analogies just from what you just said.
Sure. And on a personal level too, not, on a grand scheme, like in the ER or the hospital or something like that. But I remember very vividly many years ago, my brother was in a terrible car accident, and it was certainly a crisis moment. We were told he was not going to live. He had an unsurvivable brain injury, and we were definitely in full crisis mode. And our home pastor was speaking to my mom, who, of course, was just devastated. And he said, you have 5 jobs right now, 5. And it's make sure you eat, make sure you sleep. I don't remember the other 3, but it was just like very simple tasks. It's like you can't hardly deal with anything, but you can deal with these 5 basic things. And those are your jobs every day. And that's all you are concerned about, are those 5 things. And it was great for her to hear because she did it. She took it to heart. She did it. And, on, day 5 or 6, and it was like, all right, I have taken care of these very basic things, and now I can move on to taking on some more things.
That's huge.
That's so huge. That's such good advice. What are the small steps that you can take to help you work through a crisis? I'm reading a book right now called The Common Rule, I think by Justin Whitman Early is his name. And he has a little piece of advice I feel like applies to this. And he says, Bible before news. He used to talk about how every day he used to wake up. He's a lawyer.
Yeah.
And start his day by watching the news and all that, and all the chaos and the elections and all the things that were going on in his time when he wrote the book, and just get him so angry and worked up to start every day off. And he just learned that, I need to get up and start every day with the Bible. And I'd encourage someone who's living under that dread, what does your morning routine look like? Do you just get up and turn on the news and watch the news? Because the news, it bothers me. Sometimes I have to be careful. I don't watch the news, but I read it, and it gets you hooked. And then next thing you know, you're just super angry and frustrated and confused. And I'm learning, what? Maybe it's better to turn the news off sometimes. And what does God say about these things? And get in the Word. And the other thing he really also encouraged people to do was, do you have a really good, close, quality friend? Can you make it a habit to spend an hour in conversation with them a week? He said, and if you have a problem, don't talk about your problem. For real, instead of just dwelling on the crisis, like, see the bigger picture. I think that's kind of what's going on a little bit here. You know, talk to a friend and do life and grow. And I think all these things help us manage. And obviously there's times when you have a problem, you need to talk to your good friend about the problem for an hour. But taking those small steps, I think, goes a long way.
Mm-hmm.
I do too. If you don't, you're going to get into that adrenaline mode where you're just always in survival. You're just trying to just get from one crisis through the next crisis through the next crisis. And so your pastor's advice was good. I mean, have you eaten? Have you, can you take a walk? Can you take a breath? What can you do? So
Yeah.
good stuff.
Yeah.
There you go.
I really just want to let there be like a super long awkward silence, but Chris could have pushed the cricket button right there. Oh, crickets. So as we're wrapping this up, kind of landing the plane on this first little podcast, what is some advice we'd want to give? We summed it all up. So the first one was crisis happens, or you created crisis. Get some perspective. Choose to respond. And choosing to respond looks like leaning on the Lord. It looks like doing those healthy things we just talked about, those small steps. Do the small steps. Open up to a support network. If you caused it, consider confession, by the way, and
It's
owning
huge.
it. You may not be able to solve or change the outcome. By that I mean the consequences, but you can change the way people view you in the midst of it, and you can change the way your own conscience feels about it. If you've caused a problem, owning it and facing it head on is the right thing to do.
Yeah, I remember a guy asking a counselor on a video I was watching, well, how long do I have to keep taking responsibility for my actions? And he says, until. And he says, until when? Until you drove it in the ditch. You got to keep taking responsibility for your choices until it's back on the road. So I think sometimes you just have to realize that by doing that, you are helping yourself, and it's scary. I can think of situations where, I have made some bad choices that had bad consequences, and I thought if I could just keep them under wraps, it's going to hurt. It's going to help everybody. But the truth is, there's times when you just have to step up and say, man, I blew it. I'm sorry. What can I do to take back what I can take back from the things that I've caused? And it does begin to help. The Bible talks about sowing and reaping, and if we sow bad actions, we're going to get bad actions. Some people call it karma. We call it sowing and reaping in the Scriptures. But it also applies positively, that if I do good things and make good choices, even in seasons when I'm reaping bad consequences from previous bad choices, if I start making different choices, good choices, and doing the right thing and being honest and respectable and truthful, then all of a sudden that's going to take me in a new direction too, and that has good consequences. So
Redemption.
Yeah, amen.
how the Lord
Amen.
works.
And that's where hope comes in, where I begin to say, okay, I screwed up. I've made some mistakes. That doesn't make me a mistake. I'm not a bad person because I did a bad thing.
Yeah.
I can find hope. I can find forgiveness. I can find redemption. I can move out of this and get to a better place.
Yeah. The C+ is your grade, not your identity, right?
Ooh, there you go. There you go. That's right.
Kyla, what would you say? Closing thoughts.
Gosh, you guys have really summed it up quite nicely already.
Well, I'm glad you came.
yeah.
You said some things today that,
Kyla,
man,
we're
oh man.
We're gonna have you back on the podcast.
Yeah,
You're
for
natural.
sure.
I know
You
you were
are.
really nervous, but you did super well.
Oh, thank you.
Was this a crisis for you?
No, but I probably would have loved if you had given me your little 5-minute spiel like a few days ago.
Oh, before we did this podcast?
Before we did the
No, we wanted you to be in crisis
But I
mode
was
when
like
you came
having
in.
my own
What am
mini
I gonna do?
crisis, so it was great.
You
like,
had
it's
your
a
like
surprise.
fight or flight little response
yeah,
going on.
Yeah. No, it was great. Thank you for having me.
You bet. So as we're closing, as always, the most appropriate thing you can do during any time of crisis is really turn to the Lord.
Yeah.
And we're going to be building on that as these podcasts go, but it's really turn to the Lord. That's the best response you can be, because I love what you said, Mark, earlier about trusting the one who can do what you cannot do, or what you say the oldie said, something about...
Oh, I don't know about tomorrow, but I know who holds tomorrow.
But I know who holds tomorrow. I love that idea that I can't change this, but it's not beyond God to change.
Right.
And if God doesn't choose to change it, I have to trust that that was his goodwill for my life. Right. And it really does just come down to, can I trust God in the midst of whatever this crisis is that I'm facing? And if I can say, yes, I can trust God, then I think he fills us with his peace.
I definitely
And it's not that he's not wanting to fill us with his peace, but I think there's like a little, Star Wars. We're going to end with a Star Wars analogy.
Hey, you go, man.
Yeah, there's like a little shield generator bubble. I think God's peace is like that orbital bombardment coming down from above you. And when we get all stressed, we can't trust God. It's like we turn on our little shield generator. We're like, I'm just so stressed in my little bubble, and we keep God's peace from getting in. And you just got to put down the shield. You got to let the peace of God just flood you and bombard you.
Yeah.
From above.
Sometimes the best prayer is just a 4-letter word, help.
Help.
Don't try to be theological. Don't try to say it with the these and thous. It's just a guttural help. God answers those prayers, man.
Amen. Chris, cue the music.
There we go. Heading out.
This is our new song. You guys probably noticed when you joined our podcast. Chris,
He doesn't know where the button is.
just start pushing buttons, Chris. You're gonna find it.
Big red button.
What happened to the big red button? There.
There it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
They picked
guys,
that out just for you.
I know. I love this song so much. When Brett was showing them to me, I was like, this one
is it.
is rad. So thank you so much for joining us on the Verified Podcast. We hope to catch you again. You can find these on YouTube, Spotify, Facebook, and on our app. God bless you guys. We'll see you soon.
Bye.
Kyla, thank you again for joining us.
Thanks.
Good job.